Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Derek Miller, President and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber and Downtown Alliance. We're excited to have Senator Mitt Romney with us today to have a conversation about the bipartisan infrastructure deal that is now moving to the Senate floor. The bill is projected to include nearly $1 trillion in infrastructure investment and will provide a much needed upgrade to many of our roads, bridges, and schools. The physical infrastructure improvement will help set the nation back on a course of sustainable growth, with first-class infrastructure being a linchpin to that effort. This will be an interactive conversation that will be led today by Ginger Chin, who's the Salt Lake Chamber's Vice President of Public Policy. So we want to kick off today again by thanking Senator Romney for being with us. And Ginger, let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Senator Romney. Actually, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Senator Romney, and allow you to give a few of your talking points. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ginger. And thank you, Derek, for the chance to be with you and your members today. Appreciate the work that all of you do to keep businesses alive and thriving. Great for the economy, great for jobs. Appreciate the good work you're doing. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview. By the way, numbers get really confusing on these fronts. As Derek indicated, people are talking about a $1 trillion bill. Half of that, approximately, is what happens normally under the normal process. They call it baseline spending, and that happens over the next 5 years. So if you take that aside, which was our normal run of the historic spending, the new spending on top of the baseline is $550 billion, a lot of money. How do we get here? I mean, as you probably know, there have been four presidents that have all proposed a very large infrastructure proposal, and it's never been able to get across the finish line. And a group of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats came together and said, I wonder if we can find a compromise to actually get something done. And we did. We came up with a compromise. President Biden said he would accept it. It's not his first choice, I don't imagine, but he'd accept it. And it has a couple of key points. One is it's all physical infrastructure. There's no funny social engineering in it. 2, there are no new taxes in it. And 3, it doesn't add to the deficit. What it means for Utah, we get about $3 billion above the normal running rate. We get about $3 billion supplemental for roads and bridges to be spent over the next 5 years. We also get $234 million that will go into the state's revolving water funds. So these are funds for water projects across the state. We get $50 million for the Central Utah Water Project. $200 million goes to the Navajo Nation to get running water to the 40% of Navajos in our state that don't have running water. We get transit dollars. They come according to a formula, but we will be able to get transit dollars for new rail cars, for rail expansion, for transit expansion. We get power grid dollars, so we can upgrade our power grid. Again, that will come by grants, meaning we'll have to apply for that money. We get funding for wildfire remediation and prevention. And here again, we're going to be competing with other states for those funds. We'll apply for grants for that. We get rail dollars. A lot of money goes into rail. We can, again, apply for grants for those rail dollars. And then there's a number of things that are important to us. We got permitting reform. So instead of builders and contractors that are working on these projects having to go to one agency after the other to get various reviews like the NEPA review, they can go to one place, and that place is to get all the permits in place within 2 years. So it's to accelerate the normal time frame to get things done. Now, I must admit, this is good for us, I believe, because we need it. Utah needs the investment in infrastructure because we're growing so fast. And so we need these additional resources, and also because of the challenge that climate is presenting us, the droughts, flooding, the wildfires. I recognize that $550 billion on top of the normal baseline spending is a lot of money indeed. Now, I'd also note it's only 1/3 of what President Trump asked for. He asked for 1.5 trillion. This is 550 billion. I'd also note that we only have one other option here. We can either do this bipartisan $550 billion deal, or we can let the Democrats do a bill entirely on their own through an arcane process known as reconciliation. They have the capacity, if they choose, the House and the Senate Democrats, along with the president, to do whatever they want on infrastructure and to spend unimaginable amounts of money. And of course, they would also have in place union requirements for prevailing wage. They would have various elements that we would find unacceptable. They can do that on their own. So we only have two options here. One, vote for the bipartisan deal that we proposed, or let the Democrats do it entirely on their own. I know which of those I'd like to do. By the way, our bill isn't perfect. As anything that's going to get done on a bipartisan basis has to be, it's good for Democrats and good for Republicans. And so there's some things in it I don't like. I can point them out. We can talk about how they're doing this wrong and this is bad. It isn't anywhere near as bad as what it would be if the Democrats do their bill alone. But it's still not perfect. So I can go out and take some cheap shots against the bipartisan bill. I wouldn't do that, but I could, pointing out all the flaws in it. But there's nothing to be gained by that because the alternative is a heck of a lot worse. And so I just know at this stage, the job, I believe, of people in Utah like yourselves is to say, where should we spend this money? All this additional funding is going to come for building new infrastructure or improving old infrastructure in our state. What are the priorities? And that's not a choice, by the way, that gets made by me in Washington. Appropriately, it's made in the state. So your state legislators, the governor, they're going to make those decisions, apply for grants, decide where some of the formula money goes. But those are decisions that are going to be made over the coming year, a couple of years. And your input is going to be extraordinarily valuable there. I'll say one more thing and then turn to Ginger. And that is, okay, how likely is it that this bipartisan deal passes? I'd say it's about 60% chance it passes. I think it'll pass the Senate, but I don't know what'll happen in the House. So I'd say maybe 60% chance it passes, both houses, and the president signs it. About a 35% chance it doesn't pass, and instead there's a Democrat-only bill, which would be much more money, huge increases, in my opinion, in taxes they'd put in place and adding to the deficit. So that's the 35% chance. And the last 5%, well, that's just everything blows up and nothing happens. I don't think that's likely given the fact that Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. They have the capacity to do something on their own, but there's always the possibility that everything blows up. So with that, we'll turn to you, Ginger, for any questions you might have.
Great, thank you. Just for our viewers, I want everybody to understand that the senator may be called out to vote, so we might have to jump off just a little bit early. So we want to be cognizant of your time, Senator. Also, if you have any questions, we are compiling the questions and sending them on to the senator's team. So if you have questions that you'd like addressed, you can send those to policy@slchamber.com. So just for our viewers, I wanted to put that straight out. Senator Romney, a lot of our critics are saying that Utah does not need these federal dollars. You know, we are a very fiscally conservative and responsible state. We've touted our rainy day fund. Does Utah need this money?
Well, first I'd note that we're either going to get the bipartisan $550 billion, our share of that, or we're going to get a Democrat-only bill, which is a lot more money. Of course, we could always turn it back, but I would suggest we don't turn it back. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I'm just John Q. Utah citizen here when I come to how we'd spend it. But let me tell you some of the things that come to my mind. I mean, I think, and things I hear from people, I'm not going to put a priority on this, but I mean, we probably need better east-west connections in our valley and valleys, both for highway and potentially for transit. Little Cottonwood Canyon, we probably need to think about transit or some kind of transportation there. Tooele. Do we want to substantially increase our transportation options going out to the Tooele area and potentially transit there? I-15, do we want to widen I-15 beyond Spanish Fork and going down to Mona and further south? What bridges need repair? We have a lot of bridges that are structurally deficient. How many? Get them repaired. Water projects. Do we want funding for water projects? Broadband. There's funding in here to extend broadband to our rural communities. Boy, I think we ought to do that. There's something called PFAS. Some of you may be familiar with that, but it's a chemical that's used in fire retardant. It's a very dangerous chemical. There's funding, some $10 billion to remove PFAS. And that's something we ought to look at in an aggressive way. Rail. what comes to my mind, if we're going to have an inland port, we're going to need more rail spurs, more rail. Let's take advantage of those dollars. And let me notice something else too, which is the last infrastructure bill of a substantial nature was passed in the Eisenhower years, the 1950s. This is the first one that's been passed since then. And there's not going to be another one of these for a long, long time, most likely. We're a fast growing state. So as we think about these funds, it's important to say, where is Utah going to go over the next 20, 25 years? And what highway infrastructure, transit infrastructure would be helpful in that circumstance so that we don't get choked off either with pollution, choked off with people spending too much time and traveling to and from work and other occupations. So it's this, I would say, look, this is just like the interstate highway system. This is a once in a generation investment. Let's make sure we spend it wisely and that it allows us to meet the needs of the growth of our state, as well as the changing climate that we have. Look, there's money for wildfire remediation. There's money, as I said, for water projects. And maybe we won't need those things. I hope we won't. But if the drought continues, we sure will.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Utahns are experiencing a historical drought right now that you've already touched on. And at the Salt Lake Chamber, we've created Take the H2 Oath, which champions our businesses to save water. But the reality is that we know our reservoirs are drying up, the Great Salt Lake is drying up. I would love to hear a little bit more about the water revolving funds and how you see those funds helping with this drought condition.
Yeah, we put aside about $35 billion to go to states across the country. We'll get our fair share of that based upon a formula. Those dollars go into revolving funds, and the state can use those revolving funds either to give loans to projects which it believes are appropriate, or to make grants. The state has the option to either just grant the money, perhaps the communities that can't afford the scale of the project, or low interest loans. And these can be water storage projects, pipe projects. We put money aside, an additional $10 billion to replace lead pipes. And in the case of lead pipe projects, these dollars would, about 85% of them would go out as grants. So if we have places in the valley where there are lead pipes, and if we're concerned about leaching of the lead into the water supply, we can take advantage of those funds. So there are plenty of places, I believe, that we're going to want to take advantage of this, particularly given the drought circumstances that exist in the American West. I mean, as you know, we're the second driest state in America. Nevada's number one in that regard. We're number two, and it just says we got to get smart about this.
Yeah, we absolutely do. You touched on it a little bit about broadband, and there's a $65 billion request in the bill, I believe, that's to expand broadband access across the country. And Utah has historically had a great broadband system. We have a couple of spots where we could work on, but this also plays well into Governor Cox's One Utah roadmap. How do you see this funding pairing with Governor Cox's initiatives?
Yeah, it's hand in glove, which is the governor's initiative. I think makes all the sense in the world, which is not just to get broadband out to our rural communities, but also to make sure the speed of that broadband is, if you will, up to commercial standards. And global standards. I mean, you're not going to have a new company located in a rural community of Utah if they can't have access to high-speed internet. And so we got to get broadband if we want to make sure that our entire state is thriving. And so, yeah, there's $65 billion that goes into broadband expansion. The first priority in our broadband expansion is for rural communities. The second priority is for underserved communities. So sometimes in some of our states, we're finding urban areas, for instance, certain parts of urban areas where there hasn't been a substantial broadband investment. This allows us to get funding for those areas so that the kids in those areas have access to high-speed internet and therefore learning opportunities. And I'd note in both cases, we got people who want to be able to connect with their doctors on a remote basis instead of driving a long distance to do so. And broadband allows them to have those communications.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Senator, a lot of your critics to this bill, or the critics to the bill in general, are saying that this massive spend that you've already addressed, and it will worsen our inflation and add to our deficit, and also will pave the way for radical social spending. What's your response to the social spending and the deficit?
Well, first of all, I just underscore something I said before, which is we have only two options. One option is this bill, which is $550 billion. Or number two is a Democrat-only bill, which will be over $1 trillion on top of the normal baseline. So those are the only two options. I wish there was a third option, all right, which is a much smaller bill. That's not an option. To get something bipartisan, you have to have Democrats and Republicans do it together. And to pass the Senate requires a bipartisan bill, unless, as the Democrats have, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They have all three, so they're able to do something without our support at all. So that's part number one. Part number two, it's important on the inflation front. This money gets spent over 5 years, probably none of it spent this year, maybe very little next year. So it's spent in the out years. And this does not put money in people's pockets to go out and buy stuff. It instead improves roads, rail, transit. So it provides, if you will, in the economic terms, more supply, not more demand. It allows the economy to grow faster. So the Congressional Budget Office, looking at this, says this is going to aid the growth of the country. It's going to mean more revenue to the government down the road. So it actually will reduce the deficit, and it will provide more economic growth and good jobs. So it's a positive step. Is it perfect? No. Are there things I wish weren't in it? Absolutely. But it's a heck of a lot better than the only alternative I'm aware of.
Well, I've often said that I think economic development falls into two categories, infrastructure and workforce. And so you've hit on both of those today. Just a quick question, our business leaders, many of them have voiced, we have our transportation coalition, they've come out in support of this bill. Do you see this allowing us to be more competitive with our Asian counterparts and reshoring some of this manufacturing back?
Well, it helps. There's no question about that. The nature of our competitiveness relates to our technology, our factories, the productivity of our workforce, but also how long it takes for us to move components around. And if trucks are waiting in heavy traffic, that's costing time and money and makes our products more expensive and less competitive globally. I don't know if there are any economists who disagree. Almost every economist I've heard from says investing in infrastructure is something you've got to do to remain competitive and to be able to meet the needs of our market. If we can't do this, why we won't be learning the lessons of history. I'd also note that China invests at a rate 4 times what we invest in for infrastructure. And they're doing that because they recognize they want to dominate the world economically. And we're just behind the curve. Anybody in the chamber that's traveled to places in Asia will recognize that, on almost every dimension, our infrastructure is nowhere near competitive with that of other Asian nations.
Absolutely. Now, this is a 2,700 plus page bill, and admittedly, I haven't read it all, but I have read the executive summaries. I did see some notes in there related to cybersecurity. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see that playing out in cybersecurity, especially in relationship to the electrical grid?
Yeah, and let me note something, which is I wish I could tell you that our team of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats had written all 2,700 pages. We didn't. We took legislation from the committees that had already passed bills. We took their bills and made them the foundation of our total bill. So the water bill, for instance, came from them. The highway bill came from the committee responsible for highways and transit. So we used their legislation, and that's what built it up. That's what allowed us to come up with a bill so big in such a short period of time. And one of the areas that is being studied by a committee in Congress is cybersecurity. And so we took their proposals and we added some funding to make sure we're doing a better job educating people to be able to identify cyber threats, and then providing greater cybersecurity for the government and greater coordination of cybersecurity planning for the private sector. We're just not doing a real good job at that. I have to be honest. And by the way, we have some great companies in Utah that are leading in the area of cybersecurity. And this is going to be good for them and good for the people who work in those enterprises. This is going to become, and is going to be already a critical element of our infrastructure.
Yeah, and badly needed, actually, as we continually hear about a lot of the attacks that we're hearing about. So in this bill, you really championed some key priorities and you've already addressed some of those. There are a few that you haven't hit on that I would love to get your take on that and how these funds will be impactful for the state of Utah in particular. There's the Smart Intersections Act. I would love to hear your take on the Smart Intersections Act.
Well, that's a piece of legislation actually, which I, along with Mark Kelly of Arizona, put together. And it flows from a pet peeve of mine. And that is, I don't know how often this happens to you, but I might be someplace and stop at a red light. There are no cars coming the other way. It's just a red light. And I'm waiting for the timer to go off and let me go. Sometimes there's a magnetic plate under the highway that will register that I'm there, and will change the light after a little while. If we can have cars that are smart enough to drive themselves, we sure as heck can have intersections that are smart enough to determine whether you need a red light or a green light. And so this provides grants, states apply for it. This applies grants for states to be able to use funds for smart intersections, if you will, high-tech intersections with cameras and sensors, such that we can speed traffic. And of course, this is essential, not just now with our combustion engines, but down the road, as we have electric vehicles and perhaps we have autonomously driven vehicles, being able to coordinate the traffic signals will allow traffic to move faster. And again, the easier it is for people to get to and from work, the more economic activity we have, which allows us to have a bigger GDP, larger economy, more spending, more jobs. I mean, these things go together. And so we're saying, hey, look, let's get smart about our intersections and not make people sit around waiting for lights to change. Oh, and by the way, and those of us that are concerned about pollution and the environment, cars waiting at lights, they continue to burn gasoline in many cases, most cases. Let's not wait if we don't have to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, some of the other key areas that you were really championing, related to wildfire, you did talk about the PFAS chemical remediation, but also we're really concerned about wildfires right now, especially in terms of these droughts. There's a few pieces of this legislation that addresses wildfires in particular. Tell us why you championed that and how you've seen that benefiting us.
Yeah, I'm one of those that's toured some of the wildfires in our state. When I was running for office, I went around with then Lieutenant Governor Cox, and he was showing me some of the impact of wildfires. And it's not just the fire itself and the pollution it causes, but then what happens after the fires when there's runoff, it gets into our streams and into our reservoirs. I mean, it's a real problem. And of course, a lot of homes get lost or other structures. And this is happening all over the American West, and we got to get smarter about it. And the strategies of 25 years ago are just not up to date for what we need now. And so my legislation forms a commission made up of some people in Washington, some people from the states, and a lot of people from the private sector to come together and say, okay, what do we need to do differently if we're going to really address putting out fires and preventing fires from happening in the first place? We call specifically for additional aircraft that can scoop up water and drop water in a hurry on hot spots that flare. I just feel we got to get much more serious about wildfires than we've ever been before, because they're becoming more severe, and the impact on the lives of our citizens is not to be overstated.
Yeah, absolutely. And in particular, we had a lot of concerns around fireworks around the state of Utah, and we love to celebrate with fireworks, but that did bring a lot of concern for us. So one more item, and then I'd love to, get some of your thoughts. I know you're going to need to go vote here in just a moment. Tell us about the Central Utah Project Completion Act, and what is that, and how did it come about, and how did it end up here in your key pieces of legislation?
This is something which the federal government has been funding at a modest level over some period of time. It's already aligned in the federal budget, and so it's not an earmark. But the Central Utah folks are saying, hey, look, we need to get this done. It's a $50 million project to be completed. My understanding is that it takes water from the Colorado River. It allows it to flow by pipeline into Central Utah for the advantage of economic development there, for employers there, for homeowners there, as well as for agriculture. And if we don't have that water, with the level of drought we're seeing, why jobs, homes, businesses, and farms are going to dry up. So we need the water. And I would note that on the Sunday before we released the bill, we released it Sunday night. Sunday morning, we looked at the bill as it had come from the printer and noticed that the Central Utah Water Project had been missing. It was not in the document. And I, along with some others, said that's unacceptable. And we stopped the printing and said, we got to get that back in there. I hope it was an inadvertent omission, but whatever the reason was, we were able to get that back in there. And it's critical to our state. Likewise, the funding for the Navajo Nation. We've got some 40% of Navajos in our state don't have any running water in this day and age. And they were willing to exchange their water rights relating to the Colorado River as a nation, the Navajo Nation, in exchange for us getting running water to their citizens, which we agreed to do, but have never funded that. So we got that funded. And then, of course, there's some $234 million that goes into our revolving funds in the state that can be used for projects all over the state. This is, I mean, we need to think about this, and in my opinion, make those choices. I can't tell you where to put that money precisely, which projects to do. The state's going to have to figure that out, but I can tell you that given what we're seeing so far, we'd be wise to take advantage of those funds.
Any other key points of interest that you think our membership base would appreciate in our business community?
Well, I think you've hit the key items. I would note this is all physical infrastructure. You asked a question earlier about social programs and so forth. There's nothing of that nature in this bill. This bill is focused on physical infrastructure. Maybe one exception might be this. It's not social, but it's maybe not terribly physical. It relates to the future. And that is, there is $5 billion set aside for technology relating to hydrogen-powered trucks, trains, cars. There's $5 billion set aside for nuclear power research to see if we can find ways to generate more power with nuclear energy in a safe way. So there's $5 billion also set aside for electric technology. So we're saying, look, let's also invest in the technologies of tomorrow so we can, again, be more competitive with China, but at the same time, perhaps make it a little easier for our electric system to keep up.
And that absolutely addresses some of the growth issues that we see and experience in Utah, especially related to air quality. So those two in particular would directly have some impact on our air quality, which is wonderful. So with that, what can we expect next? You know, where are we going after this? Obviously, there's a vote. What do you anticipate? You said 60% chance in your opinion, but would love to hear what you think next.
Yeah, what's happening right now and the votes that we're having today are on amendments. So every senator is free to bring forward an amendment to improve the bill. And you have to get 60 votes to have a successful amendment. I voted for several of them. Some amendments have already passed, I think have improved the bill. And so any senator that doesn't like it can bring forward an amendment. And if they can get 60 people to vote for that amendment, they've won. But you know, let me assure you, it's very easy to criticize something. It's harder to find something that Republicans and Democrats will work together on. So we can just say no, 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 no. But if we were to say no to the bill overall, then the Democrats will do one on their own with a lot more spending, more taxes, terrible regulation, forcing the union rules with regards to wages on our project. So it's like we don't want to go down that pathway. So we're going to have amendments. The amendment process will probably be over by tomorrow evening. And then we'll begin to vote on the bill itself. There are multiple procedural votes. I presume it will pass the Senate either on Sunday or Monday, and then the House will take it up. And if the House passes it pretty much as it is, I think it'll become law. If Nancy Pelosi decides to make some big changes to it, she's going to lose Republican votes in the Senate. It would come back to us and we'd say no, and you'd end up blowing the whole thing up. I hope she doesn't do that, but that's out of my control. I think the White House will ask her not to do that because for whatever reason, President Biden has been willing to work with us on a bipartisan basis. I think he wants this to succeed. And if the White House is able to flex that muscle, they should be able to make it happen.
Well, we know this is a heavy lift, and no doubt you have not been sleeping much lately with all of this hard work, and we really appreciate it. And Senator, we always appreciate your time, and we want to thank our members who've joined us today live and those who've watched the recording. You know, we're grateful for your leadership on this issue, and we appreciate you reaching consensus with, Democrats and, working on this bipartisan bill. I know that's a lot of work. Again, if there are questions, we are reaching back out to Senator Romney and his staff, and those questions can go to policy@slchamber.com. We thank you, Senator, for your time, and we know that you are a very busy person and you've carved out a nice chunk of time for us today, and so thank you very much.
Thank you, Ginger. Good to be with you and with all the members. Again, appreciate the work that you're doing. People used to say to me when they were graduating from college, I think I want to go into public service, which is fine. I appreciate people to do that, but recognize this, which is that going into business is also a public service, because we can only provide for our seniors and for schools, for healthcare. We can only do those things if the dollars that we have to spend represent a good or service produced in the private sector. So the money we have to do so-called public service only comes if people are creating enterprises that are successful and people are getting jobs there and paying their taxes. That's how the whole system works. So what you are doing, which, let me tell you, the hardest thing in the world is keeping a business alive and growing successfully, or just sustaining an enterprise, particularly with COVID around and the drought and so forth. And yet that's critical for our country. And so I say that with genuine conviction, which is what you're doing is extraordinarily important. I know it's important for you and your family and your employees, but it's important for our entire community. I have remarked before that it's a lot harder working in the private sector, meaning in business in all of its kinds, than it is working in government. In government, things don't go well. People always just blame the other party. In business, there's no one to blame but yourself. I mean, you got to deal with whatever comes along, and by the way, if the government spends too much money, or they just go out and borrow more money, you can't do that. Your job is harder. So I admire and appreciate what you're doing, and I do my best to try and serve the interests of our state. I'm happy to receive any comments that you have. You know how to contact me, I believe, and just send in comments, and I take a look at them. We have folks that answer the phones, listen to what you have to say, and provide that information to me. So let me know what you're thinking. I'm trying to be of help here, and my suggestion to you right now is think about where these resources could be best applied for the future of our state. Well, for today and for the future, and make sure and communicate that to your state representative, your state senator, your governor, and by doing that, we'll make sure that we're making the kind of investments that'll make our lives and the lives of our descendants better. So thank you, Ginger, Derek, good to be with you and all your colleagues.
Thank you, Senator.